Socrates. The only true wisdom consists in knowing that you know nothing. That's us, dude. Oh, yeah. Let's bag him. Yeah.
Socrates. Okay, so what's that knowledge of what's truly important called? I guess that would be wisdom, Socrates. Oh, to find happiness, you must have first cultivated wisdom. Tell me how you...
All we are is dust in the wind, dude. Dust. Wind. Dude.
How is Socrates within and without? How is he liminal? How is he monstrous?
Well, very good. I thought in service of episode 8 and 7 as well, if you guys are up for it, I'd read Proclus's hymn to Hecate and Janus. I was going to say Zeus, but he labeled it Janus.
Just imagine, what if I had a strong negative reaction?
That's
Proclus.
cool. Like, I think that's part of, yeah. I mean, woe be the man who says no to the ode to Zeus. But yeah, I mean, I would respect that.
It sounds great. Bring it on.
Okay, I just want to make sure we're all on board. Hail, many named mother of the gods, whose children are fair. Hail, mighty Hecate of the threshold. Also hail to you, forefather Janus, imperishable Zeus. Hail to you, Zeus most high. Shape the course of my life with luminous light, and make it laden with good things. Drive sickness and evil from my limbs, and when my soul rages about worldly things, deliver me purified by your soul-stirring rituals. Yes, lead me your hand, I pray, and reveal to me the pathways of divine guidance that I long for. Then shall I gaze upon that precious light, whence I can flee the evil of our dark origin. Yes, lend me your hand, I pray, and when I am weary, bring me to the haven of piety with your winds. Hail, many named mother of the gods, whose children are fair. Hail, mighty Hecate of the threshold. And hail to you also, forefather Janus, imperishable Zeus. Hail to you, Zeus most high. So that was Proclus.
Brings up
Thoughts
my
about that?
mythocolloquial critique, which is, how would it sound if we actually translated Zeus and Hecate and Janus into English? Because in one sense, they're words in ancient Greek, and all the other words have been translated, but those ones have been left untranslated, so they sound to us like the names of characters.
Yeah, Sam Harris makes that point. He said, like, and also Jonathan Peugeot a little bit is that we treat you know, I won't even pick a religion, but any religion's God is like perfectly normal. And then when we hear the word Zeus, it's like yeah, like an action figure or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't do that, by the way.
People can get into the experience of it using exotic terms. That's perfectly fine, but it is one step toward turning real mythos into something like a cartoonish soap opera that's easily dismissible.
How do you overcome that?
Well, I would suggest full translation.
So what would be like a better word than Zeus, I guess?
I think Zeus is, I mean, on the one hand, Zeus is essentially the word God, right? It's deus. So you could just say God, which is a contemporary English word as well. There's a paternal aspect to it, I think, at least in the Jupiter version. You might say Sky Father, you might say God, or something like that. I mean, you do like the indigenous people would do and call it Great Spirit or something like that. You'd have to finesse what you consider to be the right translation, but I think at least attempting that translation puts us into potentially a more deeply evocative relationship with the old structures.
Yeah, no, I love that because it's I read a lot of translators, and it's a really kind of a sacred job if you look at it a certain way, and being really accurate to the translation while also trying to communicate the message to what you think your audience is or will be is really meaningful because what's his name? He's like a Christian translator, Greek translator. Where's the book? Oh, David Bentley Hart. Do you guys know him?
Mhm.
Yeah, like he translates the New Testament, and I can read enough Greek that every once in a while I'm like, is that right? And I'll look it up, and it seems like a really strange word choice, but he's really popular, and he speaks this kind of non-theistic version of Christianity. Um, that's kind of cool. So yeah, it's the way you turn a dead language into a modern text. I love it. What are your thoughts on this, Bruce?
I was just thinking of several of my students in the past. I was surprised several times because it happened more than once. It was really surprising is that the student either came up to me or else confessed in a paper that they had turned to following Greek religion as their primary spiritual practice, and that they had a relationship with the different gods and goddesses. And I admit at that time I thought, well, okay, you can play with that if you want, but I didn't take it seriously. But since then, speaking to other people I know more closely, they actually, it can turn into a viable practice again. And I know in Nordic countries, they're kind of initiating kind of the Nordic polytheistic practice. And so, yeah, maybe John is making it viable again too in a new cognitive science reframing.
I love the idea there's a subterranean current of integral Hellenism out there.
Yeah. Yep.
They're meeting in caves.
Actually, yeah, I actually have just interviewed somebody who's from Haiti and a voodoo practitioner and also very interested in integral, coming to be a student at our school. So it's going to be an interesting mix.
Yeah, if you think of archetypal stories as both spontaneously generated by the psyche and capable of training the psyche, then using these myths as those functions can really add more variables or more dimensions to the way you look at the world. And like John says in the episode, like it's not as real as this table, or it's not the same kind of reality as something physical. But it certainly seems better than kind of nihilism.
No, I think there's something about the way we've inherited these things that is not sufficiently provided by mythic contemporary entertainment. I mean, people get like, whoa, Thor, there's a movie, or right, Hollywood and comic books are full of archetypal pantheons. There's truth to that, but they haven't been carefully and orally condensed over many generations to give you a highly concentrated experience of some psycho-ontological aspect of human experience.
Yeah, and like probably similar to the way you both and John have talked about hallucinogens and psychedelics, the container in which you encounter them matters a lot. And so treating them as like entertainment to your romantic, life or something is very different than like maybe Merchalia, like a sacred space or a sacred relationship. And I don't know, I like Jung's kind of conception of complexes, and it has this negative valence because a lot of times you encounter them when your life is falling apart or when they're doing bad things, but everyone has complexes. And the way John talks about these inner things, fostering them so that you can have this symbolic relationship that you can then transfer into situations and encounters with other people, or the way you view yourself, seems like almost necessary. Like this you'd have this richness of personality to draw upon rather than whatever your parents modeled or your early formative models imprinted on you. So doing it consciously versus unconsciously seems like very, very wise and practical. And how dangerous is it, like the gods you worship, right? Because if you do it and you pick kind of foolish, I don't know, like hipster gods or something. You're like, oh, I like the sarcastic god that condescends on everybody. Then you're internalizing this force, not like some trivial cliche. Are you guys eager for Jeopardy? Is that why you're so silent?
I'm appreciating the notion of dangerous hipster gods, but I could go for Jeopardy.
Okay, I'm going to take Bruce's silence as a assent to Jeopardy.
Yes, go ahead, please.
All right, number one, finding what's common among all particular generative models and generating a generalized model.
I don't know the term for that.
Data compression, memory consolidation.
I wouldn't have gotten that. Nope.
All right, so this is a challenge. It's good. I found a game that's not too easy or maybe too hard. It's good. Perspective roles that have emerged within the economy of the psyche for dealing with types of situations, a kind of specialized memory of perspectival and participatory knowing for doing relevance realization in a particular situation.
I position.
Close?
What is a self position?
Ooh, I like that. So parts was what I was looking for there.
Okay. I was thinking parts too. Yeah, yeah.
This kind of Jeopardy is somewhat unfair because there's several terms that could apply to most things. And also we have terms for a lot of these concepts from other domains of knowledge as well.
If I had like 3 people backstage to verify whether or not they'd accept your answers, you'd probably be getting more
We'll
points.
go to the judges on that.
Yeah. Instead of monadic reified thing, the through line, eidos, multi-perspectival, multi-aspectuality of the participatory knowing, when we have this I position, also known as logos of the psyche.
What is the self?
That's correct. Yes, very good. There's one more here. The part of the self that is magical, can solve all problems, doesn't need any other help, and is wonderful.
What doesn't exist?
That's right. If you think this exists, you've learned nothing from this episode. You might as well stop looking for it right now.
It was interesting that John really wanted to emphasize that point, as if he realized partway through saying it that this is the moral message of the whole series.
To be fair, I have seen during group practices where people are trying to participate in this kind of like deductive, logocentric way. They just stop and like try to intuit some magical answer rather than, and it can actually kind of break things down. Sometimes it works. It's tricky, right? But it actually is like a kind of common phenomenon that I'll just look into my magic portal and that'll be the logos.
It made me think of, I've spent a lot of time with bodywork therapists, and sometimes you'll hear them say the body doesn't lie, right? And which, you know, the body can give you access through the neuromuscular intelligence or proprioceptive intelligence, things like that, to other truths. But the idea that it's a perfectly reliable mechanism is pretty dubious, you know, especially when you think of like a stick bug pretending to be a stick. There's so the cells are capable of attempted deception.
Yeah, it's yeah. The stick bug's like, I'm good. This will work all the time. Oh, I just got eaten. This sucks. Yeah, it's horrible.
Any one of our internal systems could be in error or could be deceptive for some reason. So they've got to cross-check and not reduce to the magical one.
I like what John was saying, and he said this in his last series too, of just trying to set up conditions for implicit learning and educating it and not overthinking it, because like the research shows the analytical the more you try to start creating heuristics and structure, it actually interferes with that system. So kind of learning these subsystems and being mindful about how they might work together or give you new insights, and then taking that up a level and having friends, like cultivating a kind of personality that people like to be around, and having good friends that can then also generate insight and joy seems like as good as you have. Or like, all right, a plethora of specialized me.
Mhm. I mean, that also feels like parts.
Right. So John said enriched eye positions.
Okay.
So he makes that kind of, especially in the first 20 minutes, the generalized compressed model, and then the many specialized models, and they're constantly updating and dying off and being generated. And so that's my last one. I'll find some good ones next time though.
I was playing with Chat GPT last night and asking it to tell me some riddles. And most of the Socratic riddles it came up with were really lame. But it did give me one that overlaps Integral and John's work. So I'm going to read you this riddle. I am all-inclusive and can be seen in everything, but cannot be grasped or held. I am both transcendent and immanent and bring order to diversity. What am I?
Time?
Oh yeah, I was gonna say a pyramid, but that was not right.
The answer is perspectives.
Interesting.
Yeah, ChatGTP is kind of cool, and Midjourney or some of those art AI generators putting. I put in, this is so stupid. I put in John Vervaeke meaning crisis in a Chinese style art, and it gave me like a Maoist dictator with like definitely nothing related to John. So
this image behind me is actually my Midjourney product. Of I asked it to produce something that was both reminiscent of Plato's cave and Greek art, and also kind of a Zen aesthetic. And so that's what came out.
Love it.
yeah, it makes sense. That looks like something Midjourney now that you say that.
Bruce, I was curious to get your take on one aspect of episode 8, which was around the sort of the privileged self positions of the I and the me, and then he also has the you for the future, because that's so close to the way Wilber thinks of the proximal and distal selves. What was your take on the similarities or differences between Wilber's take and Vervaeke's take here?
I was thinking exactly about that, about the proximate self and the distal self and the antecedent self and the shadow. So those are the 4 elements that are typically named like in the integral model. I don't think I have ever heard Wilber very often talk in terms of the thou or the you, and that's often kind of pointed to as a whole. In integral, it's got the I and the we, and the you or the thou is not emphasized as much. But the thou as the aspirational self. So you could fit it in the distal self area. There's the proximate self, which is basically where you're seeing from. So it's not really an object, it's more context out of which it's where the I position is seeing from. And then the distal self typically is some aspect of self that's been made into object by taking perspectives on it. And mostly that's referred to as parts of the self that are already existing and have been digested and maybe even left in the past, but now you own it as part of your narrative identity. But I think it could apply also to the kind of adjacent self, the one that's coming, right? Antecedent self, I didn't hear that really mentioned in that description, though John kind of gets at it with, I think, kind of like the participatory notion of the self that is basically the the adverbial dimension of the here now togetherness that he talks about, which is kind of the gathering clearing in which the perception happens. That's more like the antecedent self. And then shadow also wasn't really discussed, though I think, obviously John's very well aware of it, and it's a Jungian thing, but the aspects of ourselves that are split off. One thing this conversation brought Assagioli and psychosynthesis to my mind quite often, so I might say more about that later. But one thing here that I was relating to that model that John was talking about is Assagioli really emphasizes the ideal self and the importance of engaging with the ideal self as the aspirational self. But you have to do it intelligently, because if you chase after an unrealistic ideal self, it produces unhealth. It produces, dysfunction in different ways. So he's got what he calls the ideal self exercise, and he leads you through a series of questions, or psychosynthesis therapists will. What's your own image of yourself? Who do others think you are? Who do you wish you could be? Who do others wish you could be? A whole constellation of things about both how you self-perceive and how others kind of ideally hold you. And almost all of those are limited or distorted. And so they'll go through a careful kind of Socratic questioning and deconstructive questioning, mostly to let go of those kinds of constructs. And then you can be in the place to actually recognize what really is in the horizon of your possibility as an ideal self that could be a center of aspiration.
Yeah, that's a really interesting consideration. Like I was saying, the I-me relationship maps very closely onto Wilber. Wilber doesn't talk much about the future you self, the ideal self, and the role that plays. But I think you're right, Bruce, that it should be considered more as a constellation, and that constellation is mediated to some degree by the role of shadow. How much of the shadow we're aware tells us whether or not we're steering toward a good you or a bad you for ourselves. The other thing, I think fairly obviously, the difference between the way John was saying it and the way Wilber says it is whether the I is connected to a vast ontological witness being I, right? That's, Wilber calls it proximal because I would say it's very close to some kind of generalized Eastern mystical notion of a omnidistributed I function in the cosmos. And there's different ways to hold that, because I think Wilber's correct in the sense that for the I to function and for us to conceive its function relative to the me or to the you, we're sort of implying a metacognitive background space. You can't really think about the role the I takes without assuming that space. But is that space because it's implicit in being, or because it's being produced in the moment, or because it was produced at a lower level of the I and is now available to it at its level? I think that's a really open question. Hi, Robert.
No, I'm listening. There's a lot of, so the self is a very tricky thing in that sense. It's like it's one in many, and evolving and millions of years old. So it's really cool, these different ways. And again, like contrasting all of what we're saying to like the monadic, egoic, willing European philosophical self, and it's so much richer, and it matches on the neuroscience too. Like when they look at like Phineas Gage and a part of his brain gets taken out, and he has a personality shift, or people with short or long-term memory amnesia, and these different things that you can kind of a scientist can induce someone to like say, oh, there's no such thing as religion, and then 2 minutes later say, oh yes, I deeply believe in God. And you can imagine little nerve clusters kind of trading off their authority within a person to fit the like question that they're being asked, or the context they're in. I don't know if either of you've ever read Tanabe, the Kyoto School philosopher.
Hmm.
Yeah, like he cites a lot of Shin Buddhism and the Kyoegyo Shin-sho. I'm sure I mispronounced this. Like all the Shin Buddhists are so mad at me right now, and I deeply bow to them. But it's kind of cool because he's citing these old documents, and if you take a stance in the present, it reflects back into your past and changes that, and then reflects forward into your future. And so it's very different than this kind of static, the past is behind you, the future is in front of you, and it's actually all kind of triologically related, and especially through your intent and your state of mind and things like that. And I've done practices on that and find it deeply transformative and calming and clarifying.
I was mentioning psychosynthesis and Assagioli, and I think, yeah, just what he has done, and he's just not well recognized for the contributions. And actually, a lot of things that are taken as Jungian really came from Assagioli. And Jung picked them up because they were in close dialogue. Assagioli was a precocious kid in university who became close friends with Jung and Freud and was actually included in the Psychoanalytic Society, but gradually broke away because he didn't, into the psychoanalysis and the breaking up, he thought there needed to be an integration on the other side that he didn't see being articulated, especially by Freud. But there are several aspects of the model that I think are really salient for this whole conversation about the multiplicity of self and parts work and so many of these dimensions. But one of the things that he pioneered before Jung really developed it in the same way is subpersonalities and also active imagination work, which was for him visualization work, because his background, he was raised kind of a polymath and all that in a very rich cultural home, but his mother was deeply into Advaita Vedanta. So that is always in the background for him, even though he didn't accept it as his religious position, but there was an influence there. So for him, he always distinguished, for instance, between the I and the ego. The ego being a construct and basically a mechanism that's built out of certain things, whereas the I for him is much more fluid. It's basically a mobile center of awareness will, which is not a permanent thing, but it's transcendent immanent, which it can merge with and identify with positions, and it can step out of them and make them object. But that just the fact that I can move my awareness from my belly to my head to my hand, that's what he means by will, is the ability for it to be mobile through the system, transcendent immanent, so that it can enter into identification with pieces or step out and objectify them. And deeply going into that and finding out how that functions actually opens you up to a whole field of empathy and love, and that ability to actually disidentify from objects is only facilitated by really a deeply empathic position that allows whatever is there to present itself without interference. So he's got a whole range of things in subpersonality work. He's got the higher unconscious and the middle unconscious and the lower unconscious. The higher unconscious is those aspects that are typically our higher potentials or our aspirational goals that our society or our context doesn't allow us to entertain. So mostly we keep them in the dark. And then there are the darker impulses. And then there's the middle range stuff that just has to be offline while we do, out of conscious awareness to allow us to do these things. So pretty rich self-model that I think maps in many dimensions onto things that John was talking about the different parts and the eye positions and as the spotlight from a place. I don't know, I could go on more, but that's basically the gist of that.
There's an interesting convergence in my mind between something like Assagioli, who's bringing a kind of cognitive psychological map that starts to become more like a spiritual system over time, and Gurdjieff operating, somewhat in the same time frame, coming out of a spiritual background, but coming into a system of parts work and subselves as the necessary explication of what he thinks the ancient tradition is. Makes me think we should have a Saglioli for Time Between Worlds episode.
That would be good because, yeah, I mean, he was part of the birth of psychoanalysis. He was part of the birth of the humanistic tradition, and then he was the part of the birth of the transpersonal movement. So he was alive for and participated in and formative to three pretty significant phases of the emergence of psychological schools.
Also, just as a side note, if you've got a Haitian student, maybe Global Voices series. There was something I wanted to mention about the monadic self and sacred autonomy, as a phrase John used a few times in this series. That there's a need for, I think, a broader disambiguation of sacred autonomy, because it has these different significances, right? There's an exaggerated left brain description of the self that is maybe in opposition to an earlier model of primordial participatory freedom. There's a sense you hinted at, Robert, of like certain kinds of domestic situations privileging certain subselves as if they were the only self. But there's also some socioethical issues that are involved, right? There's a stance that the dialogical process going on within one organism should be treated socially and legally as relatively independent from the impositions of the state or the group, and that can lead to a higher form of dialogue if we secure the sacred autonomy of the individual example of the pluralistic consciousness. So that's worth considering. And then there's also sort of the quasi-Marxist critique, which is that the sense of the individual self is an ideological byproduct of a certain kind of socioeconomic model that requires you to pretend you're a monadic self in order for the system to keep running. Those are some, there's a lot of different interesting dimensions to it, some very valuable and some very suspicious.
Yeah, the idea of over-identifying with roles you have and then having people over-identify you as your role is very parasitic. And there's a whole line of research that's come up even in the last 15 or 20 years in psychology on emotional labor. And it's all like, I have to fake being a certain type of person at my job for hundreds of hours a month or thousands of hours a year. And it's like super maladaptive to the people that have to do that. And we're kind of, as we move more into like the customer is always right kind of culture, it becomes this it's ironic because it's a self-imposed tyranny. We're all into the idea of consumerism, and then that traps us into the idea of being the role that pleases everyone for half of their day. And opening this stuff up, it's so cool because there's all these resources, and I was blessed to get to hang out with Pierre Grimes and listen to him interpret people's dreams. And there's all this patterning happening. And if people can have access and get some sense made into those patterning, every single person I saw happen, they're like, oh, I feel so good. It feels like there's justice happening to me, because it's a Plato club. And so it was just kind of magical to see that all of this stuff that 100 years ago or 75 years ago was either like mechanistic or taboo, when it's actually applied is deeply nourishing and liberating to the people that get to experience and practice it.
Something that came up for me in this episode when John was talking about the Solomon effect and the therapeutic utility of taking a third person stance toward your first person experience. All right. And first of all, it's not like, we're mechanistic reductionists who think the magic was just shifting to the third person, right? Probably any shift adds an additional perspective, and that has most of the value in it. But what it brought up for me was a question around a certain kind of inner practice. Right. So Deepa Ma stands out in my mind, 20th century female sage. her primary practice was to try to objectively label all of her first person experience, right? I'm thinking of a cat, she's thinking of a cat, or whatever it is. You're going to make that shift. And so what it seems like phenomenologically you're doing is creating some adjacency between you and the thing you were identified with, but not so much that you're dissociated from it. You're trying to get the right positioning space. But is that fundamentally the move, or is that a side effect of the fact that additional complexity and connectivity are being added? So you have a thought of a cat, and then you have this additional connected thought, which is, that's the thought of a cat that she's having, right? So you're getting like two thoughts for the price of one. You're doubling the amount of semantic stimulation and connectivity in your system. And maybe that's the underlying mechanism, and the sense of a readjusted relational distance is the result of something that's been produced by that additional complexity.
Yeah, I think I do that kind of practice, and I'll just take my thought and I'll turn it into passive voice. So I'm looking at Bruce's wonderful face. Bruce's wonderful face is being looked at by me. And in the course of like 10 minutes, you'll have a bunch of thoughts with a bunch of objects in your environment. And it kind of creates, I think, what the Greek middle voice probably felt more like, where you're both a cause and an effect, or there's this much, I mean, like myth and narrative do this so much more naturally, because they are all of these symbols and thoughts interacting in a kind of I love what we talked about last time, in this like topographical place, and the place has meaning and time has meaning. And when you start to get that, instead of just like a very one-to-one linear thought mapping, all of a sudden you're relating in the world as a drama unfolding, rather than as like a I don't know, I would picture like a skinny like nerd, like little thoughts popping up and like, I have to dominate my environment with my thoughts or whatever. So yeah, I think that's really important to think about and to have as a practice.
I'm thinking of a couple things. One is, I think related to that, in thinking about the parts and their relationship with each other. In psychosynthesis, the goal used to be to identify all the parts and then try to synthesize them into a more coherent whole, a more coherent singular identity. But as psychosynthesis developed and the practice kind of matured, they really moved away from that. And the idea now really is only for the I to be able to interact basically lovingly with all parts. And there's no need for all parts to be integrated with each other or to get along. They don't need to be subsumed into a single master system. Some of them might find their way integrated on the way towards some kind of integration, and if they have a way of complementing and completing each other. But that's in that context of practice, it's no longer the goal. It's more the unification or the synthesis is now coming through basically the empathic enfoldment of multiplicity.
Yeah, that's a question I look at a lot, which is, I mean, we start from a position where there's a sort of naive notion of a unified self, then we expand and go, oh, really, I'm a self-aware plurality. Now is the subsequent goal after that to integrate that? And there's a kind of a yes and there's a kind of a no. The no is you don't want to just have a centralized power structure where all of it's subsumed under the I. But the yes is you do want a higher level of coordination between all these parts, such that they are a kind of a supra psyche in a way that the I can then be in dialogue with. And that's something that actually leapt out to me in this episode is, in the daemonian, there's lots of different parts of yourself you can dialogue with. You can have a dialogue with the future self and the past self and the subconscious. But there's also a kind of a success of integrative processes that creates an aspect of the self which is not quite the same as the I. but seems to supersede what the I can do. And then the I can be in dialogue with that as a kind of privileged interlocutor of its own, not future, but currently existing additional coherence version of itself that is not subsumed to the I, but which the I is in a special relationship to.
I like that. Oh, go ahead, please, Bruce.
You go. I just raised that first question. It's your turn. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think it matches John's prajna practice, in the idea of stereoscopic selves instead of stereoscopic skills, in that if you have the capacity to have a type of personality that fits well one way, and then you develop a second type of personality that fits well another way, and then they talk to each other and a new unity emerges. I mean, this is also kind of like alchemical, symbolic, like the one begets the two, begets the three, begets the one, and it's all symbolic. So it's not like a math equation that 2 + 2 = 5, but like a more of a spiritual alchemical process of evolving specialized differentiated things. And then once they're kind of mature enough, allowing them to reintegrate the way the left and the right eye, or the left and the right ear, or joy and sorrow can become melancholy or something. Like, there's lots of good examples of this. And if you kind of staple John's like neither utopia nor nostalgia and just look at it as like kind of an ongoing process, sometimes a part is dying, sometimes new parts are being born, sometimes they're integrating, and keeping that as a conscious part of your awareness, then it makes a lot of sense to me. That the same way new relationships, it's not like you have 5 relationships your entire life that never change. There's constantly new relationships, and they're evolving, and parts of you are being adduced that were never adduced, and so much more playful and dancing than like, we've made it, we've had our prophet and we're done, or whatever it is. I think Chop made that reference in the series.
I liked a couple things that John got into in this conversation. One was, his reference to Steve March's work with Aletheia or Aletheia. How do you pronounce it? Is it Aletheia?
I say Aletheia, but I'm open to both.
I say Aletheia too, but John kept saying Aletheia, so I'm modifying here. In any event, yeah, couple things. I liked also his experience in being kind of vulnerable and talking about Hermes, and maybe I'll come back to that. But just in general about the parts work associated with Steve March's approach, I just want to say I wholeheartedly endorse it. I've been involved in that this past year and going through his program, and his way of working with the parts is different from, IFS. It has some similarities, but it's integrated into these kind of fuller ranges of, you could say, psychic potentials than is typically recognized in IFS. And also it doesn't center around the monadic self in the way that IFS does. My experience, and this is just really a testimony for that approach, is a number of people are long-term IFS practitioners or coaches or whatever who are taking this training. And I've heard them in multiple meetings say, why would I ever go back to IFS? This works so much more powerfully. And I think it's because it's integrating multiple forms of psychology, but also contemplative wisdom in depth and neuroscience in a pretty fruitful way. So I was really glad to hear John just, giving a recommendation for it. And I definitely second that. And for myself, it's been an interesting experience going through. I've done subpersonality work and I've done Asajoli kind of stuff, and I've done diamond approach. So I've done things that bring me into the same territory, but nevertheless, this works in a unique way. But one thing that is kind of related to the Hermes thing, and maybe we can come back to it, but when you're working with the parts in this way, they're nevertheless all kind of encountered as aspects of a general constellated me. You can relate to them and dialogue with them and have relationships and actually open up aporias like John discussed. But that's different from experiencing your mind inhabited by something that seems to have a different agency and a different biography, like a Hermes. So that's an interesting tension there, and it brings up a few things, but maybe we can touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, I'd like to get into the Hermes thing and the difference of quality of some of the seeming internal parts. But I'd also second the endorsement of Steve. I have a lot of trust in Steve. My partner's going to start doing the Aletheia training next month. And one of the things that John was discussing that I hadn't heard quite this way before was his experience of trying to get the parts to reflect on themselves. And that struck me as very fertile, because there's a possibility that you could get a different internal dialogue going among parts that have developed the capacity to self-reflect. And that would be different than normal parts work. So that intrigued me.
Mm.
Yeah, the what you just said, Layman, is really cool, because in the Jungian lineage, the idea that like our capacity to speak in kind of semantic language is very, very new, but there's parts of our biology that can problem solve and thrive in other ways. So getting them to kind of mature and become more of like a part of the team rather than just kind of act out or shy away, and then sometimes reemerge as like trauma or as annoyances or something in your psyche is really, really profound. And again, that Tanabe book, the idea that like one of the mistakes of Kant and the kind of European Enlightenment rationalists is they never questioned rationality. They never put rationality itself under the lens of rationality, which creates this kind of metanoetic, he uses like death and resurrection as like a Christian metaphor. Action, faith, witness is instead of having kind of rationalization and rational discourse or intuition as these kind of primary modes of being, acting and then observing, and then reflecting at the end of that is a way to break free from the monological grip of any one perspective. And it's interesting that John is choosing to go into this more esoteric, alchemical, almost occult realm rather than stick with as much cognitive science as he did, because he demonstrates this episode there's unlimited cognitive science to discuss, and he could frame it all in terms of, well, here's the model, here's the theory, and never use words like ritual or daimonian. And still it's kind of cool where these worlds are speaking, and even today some of the people you brought up are really using a much richer vocabulary and a richer perspective that's trying to integrate like the Henri Corbin's kind of super insight and Jung's emergent unconscious Freudian thing. And yeah, it's fascinating to reintegrate the mythic and the symbolic with the rational. So yeah, it's very exciting. I like where this is heading.
So let's come back around to the Hermes thing. I wrote an article recently about Andrew Sweeney's going to do a course called Back to Hermes, which is a play off John's After Socrates. And he's thinking of that course as being sort of the lunar magical complement to the rational Athenian masculine approach. And I've often, in conversations with John, been, oh, yes, that's very much what the occult traditions have been doing. So there's a sense where he doesn't go there primarily. So it's interesting to hear him confess Hermes, and also guardians and allies, and a lot of very shamanic magical stuff was present in this episode. But what do we think about Hermes? What do we think about Philemon? If there's a difference in quality or enactment style between some types of archetypal others within ourselves and the regular subselves community, where do we think that difference is instantiated? What's the reality of that distinction?
I know in the Jungian system, and I'm still learning this a lot, but there's kind of the consciousness, right? And then there's like ego, persona, those kind of things. Wishy-washy authentic self might sneak in there somehow. And then there's the personal unconscious, and everything anyone's ever been imprinted on, especially from like early family, first contrasexual relationships, those kind of things, early mentors, is all in that personal layer. But then there's at least, I don't know, 4 to 6 other layers where there's like the kind of small communal, maybe the 150 the Dunbar number level, and then there's the bigger communal, because clearly humanity for a long time has been able to keep cities of 5 to 40,000, and there's some archetypal structure in there. And then it goes even into like the collective unconscious, which has, maybe Job's Leviathan, or weird symbolic angels and things like that. And then there's, the Jeffrey Rath he cites in this episode. This he calls it the psychoid. If the collective unconscious is level 2 and the personal is level 1, he labels it 2.5, which is very Pythagorean to me. It's very kind of funny with numbers, that it makes you think that there's this kind of popping out that happens to some people sometimes. And it's the really real, to use Platonic language, it's how maybe symbols first emerge or emerge from within a person. I have this, let me cite this guy's name correctly. Have you ever heard of Rick Veitch, Roaring Rick's Rare Bit Fiends comic books? He's a very like interesting indie comic creator, and he had this archetypal experience where he was having low level psychoid experiences, and all of a sudden this like sphere, I think, popped into his awareness and it wouldn't go away. So he drew it all out in comic books, and it's there with him at the supermarket. It's there with him when he's at home. There's this kind of imaginal presence that becomes like a permanent fixture in his reality. And he relates to it very positively. And the Jungian that turned me on to this comic book was trying to, give me some kind of model for how these things might look, rather than spooky or uncertain. And it's kind of cool that these symbols, and it sounds like for John in particular, they were very clarifying. Like now he's dialoguing with this psychic force in a way that he feels is productive, experts feel is healthy, and so on. So I think it's, again, like way outside of what you'd learn in maybe like a high school science class or an intro to psych from the last decade, but it seems real and worth exploring.
There's a curious difference between forms like that are apparently auto-generated or exogenous in some way, and then those that are maybe more intentionally created. And the old Theosophists talked about thought forms, but I was thinking there's a subculture called the plurality community, and they really are meeting and talking about different ways that they experience plurality within their psyches, and they navigate how much to share publicly and what ways to talk about it. But there's this whole phenomenon within that called tulpamancy. And you familiar with tulpas? Yeah, tulpa is like from Tibetan Buddhism, and it's a practice of generating a semi-autonomous imaginal entity that typically will serve a purpose. It will help you engage in dialogue, or it will actually carry out certain tasks for you while you do other tasks. Or it'll serve multiple functions then it will dissolve. But it's not just like consciously thinking up something. It's actually something that's instantiated in a way that it actually has felt autonomous existence and separate agency from yours within a system, right? But it's self-generated and self-created. And so that's within, Alexander David Neal, one of the famous old explorers who went over to Tibet, century more ago, she experimented with it, but what she was able to generate seemed to get out of control for herself, and she ended up actually consciously dissolving it because she got a little bit frightened by what she had manifested, and she wasn't sure how to handle it. And when I was over in India, I knew a student that happened to on a long retreat. She manifested something and she couldn't get rid of it. She ended up going to a hospital. So it's not something to play with lightly. But within the tulpomancy community, for the most part, people have been able to generate tulpas that do have some of their own personality and independence, and they've been psychologically assessed, at least in some initial studies, and they're actually high functioning, healthy people. The presence of these other experienced agentic forms within them is actually providing some kind of psychic nourishment for them, and learning opportunity and relational opportunities and other kinds of things that are leading to high functioning individuals with a lot of self-reported happiness. And so it's not something I think that we can just brush aside, as it's not dissociative identity disorder where there's an actual fragmentation that it doesn't serve the individual, or that it leads to dysfunction or confusion or other things. It's actually a plurality that's serving the individual. But then the difference is, with a tulpa, and this is what they talk about in the plurality community, a tulpa is one that's self-generated intentionally. You imagine it, you create it, you infuse it with life until it actually begins to function that way. Whereas in other cases, something seems to spontaneously manifest that doesn't seem to come from, personal intent.
If people haven't seen the third recent season of Twin Peaks, and you should, because it's one of the strangest things that's ever been on TV, tulpas play an important role in that series. Many of the characters turn out to have been intentional imaginal creations of the hybrid between the demon Bob and Agent Cooper, who's returned to the world.
Wow.
I think one of the curious things about tulpas and us having some kind of agency in regards to forming the imaginal into quasi-autonomous characters is that we might be able to do that at different levels of our own psyche. And it's one thing to be consciously involved in that, but there might be deeper, more subconscious or more primitive layers that can do tulpa creation without our conscious awareness of it. And that might be more dangerous and more disintegration oriented than the more conscious, interestingly health oriented version of the tulpa practice. I'm curious about the ontology, right? One classic way is to think, well, there's a domain, right? There's a subtle realm, and these are entities that exist in that realm, and they can impinge on your psyche when they match up to different events there. But another one that's interesting to me is, because I started out with this as a developmental model, was Timothy Leary's notion of the neurogenetic unconscious. And he thought that the Jungian collective unconscious mapped to the intracellular life of the brain. And so it might be the case that the types of entities that we see or seem to generate that have an autonomous life of their own might be mappable onto subcellular structures. And we just haven't really looked closely at how that might work yet, because there's whole civilizations going on inside the cells, as we can see now. But do they have flavors? Do they have characteristics? Is one of those functions showing up as Hermes throughout multiple minds over multiple millennia? I think that's a really interesting potential place to look for correlations.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to start to look at the correlates between neurology and biology and these phenomenon, instead of a kind of wishful thinking model where you're like, I wish I had a god that was like this, and trying to will them into your life. Think about, because if you have really good parents, let's say, and they teach you a lot, and your teachers get you to dream up and plan for maybe the first 30 years of your life, and you've got a really good, well thought out, conscious and learned map of the first 30 years. When you get to start having problems as a 35-year-old or a 45-year-old or a divorcee, or things that weren't in those original maps, you drop down into unconscious habits because you have to act, or you consciously try to formulate new things, or maybe these symbolic ways as a kind of parallel to the unconscious and conscious ways, to say, okay, well, now that I'm in this new phase of my life or in these new set of situations, how can I have personality structures that can help me navigate these more automatically than in this kind of top-down problem-solving, herky-jerky, or very, very unconscious. Now I'm barely really processing reality as it's uniquely unfolding, and I'm just framing everything maladaptively from what I learned 20 years ago. And I think like nervous breakdowns are really interesting, because if you've never had a nervous breakdown, or you've never had really severe panic or anxiety, and then you're in like your 30s and it happens for the first time, you go, what on earth is happening? And then you can rebuild, if you rebuild in a healthy way, like a new self or a new personality, and then you're put in another context where your kind of self doesn't work and you have to rebuild. It's usually easier the second time or the third time, especially when your culture is encouraging it rather than discouraging it, because I think everyone at some point encounters a problem bigger than they're ready for. And like in mixed martial arts, there are these like alpha champs, and they go 80-0, and then they lose really badly, and then they become a horrible player because it like wrecks their psyche back down to a level they don't even feel familiar in. And now they don't have confidence to even beat a much weaker opponent that they would have probably beaten before. So these dynamics of like, oh, myself, I don't need to know it, like John says, I don't need to understand how it works to live through it. But if we're able to have a mindful map, or set of practices and processes that can adduce this. And then I think the other thing you all mentioned that's incredibly important, especially I think in when people like John, who have so much stature, people hear people like him, they go, oh, I'll try that too. I'm going to bring my own Hermes. And it could have very negative consequences, because even when you flick off a little piece of kind of shadow consciousness, it can blow way out of proportion and, spin out into your work life or your family life or your social life if you're not careful. Things like rest, like slowing down the rate of the practice. Humor is a really, really good counter agent to inflationary kind of shadow things. Kind of calorie dense food, embodiment, like I as part of my alchemical practices have this orange in my freezer. I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but it's got like a texture and a feel that just engages a different part of my mind and gets me out of this kind of mythic, which is, the mythic mode is not quite as cause and effect based as our everyday consciousness. So knocking back into the cause and effect world can help avoid some of those very what does John say? Horror. At the edge of awe is horror. So getting you back down into like awe and then wonder and then, maybe even a little boredom can be healthy.
Yeah, a lot of that is advice used in transpersonal psychology for dealing with spiritual emergencies. I liked that John was mentioning John Rowan, just for our own selfish reasons, but John Rowan is a well-known integral and transpersonal psychologist, and John was recommending one of his books on the dialogical self, and the different kinds of practices that can help you engage in forms of generative parts work. But John Rowan has also written, among others like Christina Groff and other people, have written a lot on how to handle spiritual emergency when these kinds of emergencies, emergences, these things that are erupting into consciousness that have some degree of numinosity, some newness or strangeness to them, that can be enriching, but if not held in the right context, can also be destabilizing and disturbing, and lead to loss of function rather than enhanced functionality. Then, yeah, a lot of that stuff is recommended in terms of, grounding and physical work, in heavier diet, breathing, all kinds of different things that you can basically, I would say in large part reorient towards the sensory physical and away from the subtle.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential for improvised ritual work to do that, but that requires a certain facility with that's already been developed. So the most basic practices, I think, are physiological grounding of various kinds, whether it's touching something or eating something or working your body or going into nature or something like that. One of the things that's on my mind from this episode around implicit learning is, and I'm a huge fan of implicit learning. I'm realizing, looking back over the course of my life, that some of the things I thought of as a dispute between myself and the social was actually a dispute between the participatory and the propositional. Because I've often gone to places where, you go to like a sacred site and at the entrance, there's a sign and somebody wants to tell you a spiel about the site, right? And I've sometimes been very aggressive about, I don't want to hear that. I don't want pre-framing from the propositional before I have the experience. That's grotesque. And I always used to do things like get to know a place by getting lost and finding my way out. And that was just an immersion experience. I didn't have coordinates mentally to find my way out. So the implicit and the immersive form of subconscious intelligence building has always been really important in my life. But there's a question around, what's the scale of intuitive intelligence that's provided by these activities? So if I'm immersively adapted to an implicit understanding process in a certain ecological or evolutionary niche, I get a certain intuition about how to handle these problems. But these problems are also part of the whole universe. I'm also adapting to reality, to the basic computational syntax of being, to time and space itself. So I think there's a really unknown question about how far the range of my intuitive adaptation goes, right? When I have an intuitive impulse, is it pertinent only to the narrow area in which I developed that subconscious skill? Or does it tell me something about realities in general, about long ranges of time, about the experience of other people in different circumstances, which is the claim of a lot of people who favor intuitive intelligence, but we need to be skeptical of that claim. And I think we just don't really know what the scale of intuition's applicability is.
Well, yeah, because I've studied transfer training, and if you need the noise, like John talks about that, like, because if you overfit to a local environment, it might not transfer at all. And if you you want you sometimes can overfit in so many ways, and the embodied part, like John talks a lot about Rafe Kelly's retreat, and it's all physical, playful, nature immersed, social kind of rituals, and then you leave that and you've done such a kind of a workout to your different parts of your nervous system that it then transfers out into the rest of your life, and you're going, oh, now I'm at work writing like a really high level paper, but my working memory, all three-dimensional space of it and all the modes are I'm able to visualize in terms of like a diversity of things, and that you see this too with early childhood development when a child is in a very rich sensory environment and there's a lot of calm, which is really important, then they have all of that kind of transfer into their adult life. And if you have like a sensory poor environment or a really chaotic environment where they don't have that kind of loving structure to be able to integrate and feel safe, then they're dysfunctional for a very, very long time as well. So getting that right is profound, because a lot of things don't transfer well, and you can literally in a class teach an analogy that should perfectly answer the next question you're going to ask them, and no one takes that analogy into the new problem, and so we're very poor at that kind of an analogical transfer. So yeah, I think these are all, and that's, I think, part of the ecology of practices. When I do yoga, it's like half mental, half physical, and so and even like, you know, it ruins the half and half, maybe a third emotional as well. So I really try to cultivate a lot of sense of positive feelings and playfulness, and then bring that into the mental and physical practices. And then I find, like, not only is it within those contexts kind of sacred and good and healing, but then the mood transfers out to the rest of my day. The agility transfers out. So when I'm like trying to sneak through a crowded place or balance something, like I drop my keys and try to grab them quickly, or concentrate on a conversation with two geniuses who reference things from 5,000 years of history and 75 different cultures, then I can maybe, you know, use those skills to transfer a little bit. And the last thing I'll say too is I think I like what you're saying, Layman, about if you start too much with the propositional, it can create a kind of schizophrenia if it doesn't match up with the actual reality. Nora Bateson and her father, Gregory Bateson, have some cool models that show that, like, if your experience is first person felt, but then you can't ask questions and people tell you things that don't match, you get into this kind of confused state. So I think, yeah, there's so many cool things that we've been talking about in these last 10 minutes that
I want to hear Bruce's feeling on the subject of the range and modes of applicability of implicit learning and intuition. But I wanted to just hit a quick coincidence button here, because Robert, you and I had a great conversation about egregores. And I started really taking egregores seriously because of a pod that I was put in with Steve March and Rafe Kelly in Vermont. And we had no intention to speak about them. It's just that we got a good collaborative flow going, and everything we started saying was about sort of how to regenerate magical defenses against egregores under social stress conditions for people. And we were very puzzled that this was what was coming out of our mouths, but it was very entertaining. So that's several different things out of this conversation circling together for me.
I want to hear all about that. I don't want to talk about implicit learning. I want to. Yeah, I do. You know, basically, I resonated a lot with what both of you have shared, and I remember something that you talked to me about, Layman, that I resonated with pretty strongly because of my own childhood, which most of my childhood was spent outdoors. We had about 3,000 acres of forest behind my house, and so I could wander for days and be up in trees and explore abandoned buildings and, you know, down in ravines and you know, So that kind of, I think, immersion in fundamentally new environments that demanded constant heightened sensory attention to multiple dimensionality of what was presenting itself, and to be able to find my way back sometimes from very deep journeys out. I remember once I ended up very far out in, I found an abandoned cabin way out there, and I was exploring it, just like looking through the windows, and all of these noises started up around me, sounded like branches breaking of something approaching, pretty large. And I looked around and recognized that I had no idea where I was. I couldn't even say which direction to start walking to get back in the direction noise started, and my body darted, and I ran nonstop without error exactly to the same place that I had entered the forest from. But there's no way I would have known how to do that if I had to consciously navigate it. But it was there in me, and then it got activated by that noise. But in general, though, you talked about climbing cliffs and things like that, and that led you to feel a certain kind of flexibility and agility and thought. And I feel like that sensory motor immersion and training does have a real impact. For me, it was enabled me much before philosophy became an interest to create entire imaginal worlds and navigate multidimensional imaginary realities in the fiction and the art and other kinds of things I would create. But I really felt there was a transfer of that kind of attention to detail, implicit attention to detail, Gelassenheit, allowing and letting be attention, that was permeating and shaping.
Yeah, there's something essential there, I think. And I wrote a Substack article called Dogos recently about this, but it was partly based on some of the discussions I had with Rafe Kelly about how far down the stack you have to go in order to regenerate broadly applicable forms of intuitive intelligence, right? So it might be that the neuromuscular is a place where you can learn things that are tremendously applicable. Just like when we think of a child sort of, just dropping objects, a very early child, and it's doing physics experiments. And those experiments are applicable to, as far as we know, the entire universe. Very broadly applicable implicit learning. Although there might be other forms of implicit learning further up the stack that are more abstract, more complex, and maybe because of that, more specialized. And if we want to continue to grow the sort of generalized applicability of our intuition, we might have to go further down the developmental stack and re-energize learning processes at those deep levels.
I mean, it makes me think about Lakoff and Johnson. I know that John has a little bit of a conflicted, relationship with them, agreeing with some things and disagreeing with others. But basically the idea of the metaphorical foundation of most of our thought, and the metaphor built out of sensory motor, somatic coping with the environment. Almost all of that provides, the base structure on which metaphor is built, and then abstract conceptual thinking grows out of that. So I think that really is very essential.
It is interesting because in the way I'm mentioning Rafe Kelly a lot, but there's sort of a physical activity thing that can regenerate those sorts of skills, especially in ecological environments. But there's also something deep in a lot of forms of therapy and a lot of forms of energy-oriented spirituality where you return to somatic experience, right? Where you, instead of just, what are you thinking about, what's coming to mind, how do you feel about that? It's, where is it located in the body? Or I just got this wonderful DVD in the mail of the teachings of Swami Rudrananda, who was Adi Das' initial teacher. And he's very focused on letting go of the associative ideas, narratives, and emotional responses to incoming things and experiencing them purely as somatic intensity flows. And that this is his recipe for ongoing evolutionary growth as a complex human being, right? So there's something there where he's actually taking it back to a deep place in the body. He's trying to go further down the stack and have it just be, how does that register in your organ system? Things like that. And that shows up in a lot of contemporary therapeutic and spiritual traditions.
Well, especially like we're so disconnected from the body, and we're so like kind of a delayed gratification is one of the most rewarded things in our culture, and it really suppresses the immediate like smell. You don't care about what smells are in your 300-foot location when you're trying to publish some amazing research paper or launch a new rocket to Mars or whatever, and then recoupling and unexapting all of this exacted neural architecture for what it was designed to, because we're such a pluripotent kind of flexibly cognitive agent that, and John even talked about this when he came back from Return with the Source, and almost his exact language was like he was back in his skin. And I think Tai Chi does that for me profoundly. You just will within minutes start to notice all these extra details that are in the water or in the world around you. Or instead of having all these thoughts about things, you're just watching people walk by without having to kind of label how they relate to you or how you relate to them. And like every time you do that, there's this, it's like a phoenix, right? It just renews you, and then you can function well. And especially if you start to have a consistency to your practice. I remember this astronaut when COVID happened and people were like seeking wisdom on how to live their lives within just their house and behind these masks and away from all of their old kind of activity. He said, get a routine and get a physical routine. And just that consistency, that embodied consistency, you go, oh yeah, I can function. It's not as out of control as my purely cognitive appraisal had me believe. I think Bruce is going for a walk. He's like, that's good advice. I'm gonna get out of here and start smelling the world
into
again.
the Hellenic mysteries.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was looking deeper into the cave. I have a kitty cat sleeping next to me, and she wanted outside, so yeah, had to open the door. Yeah.
I love how when cats or dogs get up from sleeping, they naturally just engage their body, and we don't. Like people are so mechanical. They'll jump right into checking their phone and starting their routine. The capacity for us to like put culture into our nervous system and ignore its natural fit can be seen in animals so easily.
Mm.
So do you have things that you do? I mean, I think both of you kind of do, but do you have things that you do that implicitly help you to like flourish? Because I like that idea of we have this rich implicit system, and if you can just give it really good conditions, then instead of being like in this correlational search, it picks up on the relevant patterns much more effortlessly than our kind of planning executive function.
I think it's hard to pick those things out. I certainly, and maybe Bruce as well, have adapted to a life that consists largely of such practices. I think there's a lot of, well, one of the things that leaps out to me is elemental practice. Right, and that's an interesting way to engage the body, but just go and be in different kinds of weather. Right, Wim Hof does this too. Right, I'm fortunate enough to have cold winters here, so I can go outside with most of my clothes off and just let myself be impinged upon by the season. But go in rivers, go under waterfalls, experiment with fire, roll around on the ground, things like that that are really ancient, not ancient like ancient in civilization, but way more ancient than human civilization. And not necessarily associative symbolic practices. It's not that fire represents something, it does, but also just go and make a fire, be near it, feel the smoke, feel the heat, touch the sooty sticks, break them in your hands. Like, do a lot of elemental immersion engagements that are updating your implicit intelligence about the world and reinvigorating the parts of yourself that are at the layer of creating these more broadly applicable intuitive patterns, and also helping you out of the postural and, let's say, bioelectric pattern that we tend to get into in our various social behaviors, right? It's the same as getting a massage in a way. We tend to contract the electrical stimulation flows in our body, and then also it becomes contracted within our nervous system, and just being touched and altering that stuff. And it can be somebody's massage, or it could be acupuncture needles, or it could be being under a waterfall for 5 minutes. It really resets the electrophysiology and allows you to return to a more complete neural mapping of the world you live in.
Yeah, and in nature too, like you encounter all of these little microscopic organisms that interact with your immune system and your other organ systems, and like revitalize them and go, oh yeah, I have a function. I better start sending some metabolism to that part of me that I was not really doing that to, and then it kind of filters in back to the rest of you. We talked about this before, this forest breathing idea. And there's some good ecological kind of psychology research that it's really good to go barefoot in beaches or in parks. And yeah, that's excellent, Layman. Bruce, do you have any kind of external conditions that set up a healthy union with the world?
A number of things. One of them, which I really love, which I got in Arizona from Navajo tradition, and they basically Diné tradition, and they basically prescribe as much as possible to be present with bare feet on the earth as the sun breaches the horizon, and to drink up as much of the sun as possible at dawn. And that's like, even if the old people aren't doing it, they send the kids out to do that, to be in the sun when it breaks the horizon. So I wake up pretty early naturally. So when I can, I'll go out and walk barefoot we have a grassy park behind the house, and I'll go walk on that as the sun's coming up. I like to do massage. I get massage sometimes, but I also do Kumye yoga. And Kumye yoga involves both some pranayama, but also some self-massage techniques, different. You've probably seen, videos of Tibetan monks where they're, doing the certain kind of vase breathing, and they're rotating their bodies, and, they're doing all kinds of. Kumya yoga is drawing on a lot of that, but it actually does self-massage as well, in terms of stimulating all the nerve centers of the body, and getting energy flowing. And just something that I wanted to mention earlier that I didn't, but that I want to touch on the importance of the body and the experience of that, is that dimension of the Aletheia work with Steve that makes it so powerful, is that not only are you starting at the depth of parts, but you can move towards the depth of process and the depth of presence and absence and non-duality. And there's a pretty natural flow. It's assumed within the practice that all those things are available at any time if the conditions are right for moving into that. And the last session I had with somebody who was like me, a long-term meditator, neither one of us stayed in the parts work very long. It moved pretty quickly to process and presence and absence. And it was really, I don't know what to say, except just I had some really wonderful, profound experiences dialogically, intersubjectively, entering into some wonderful, mutually shared, embodied present states with another practitioner, where it almost felt transjective in the sense that a lot of what you were tracking, it wasn't entirely clear whether you were tracking it in their own experience or your own experience. And so there had to be a mutually checking back and forth because of the crossover of a seemingly shared field, embodied field. But it was really powerful and psychoactive.
Two things popped up for me while you were saying that stuff, Bruce. And one is, yoga, pranayama, breath work, interpersonal dynamics. I was thinking of relaxation. Really, I was thinking of this beautiful section in Hakuin's autobiography, right, where he's succeeding really well with his non-dual practice, but he gets the Zen sickness and he has to go and find a Taoist priest who teaches him how to be grounded and how to relax and how to return to his body so that his more advanced meditative states don't ruin his ability to self-regulate. It's a very beautiful book, and it's a very beautiful section of that book I recommend. The other thing was when you said sending them out to drink up the sun. And I think the basic metaphor of metabolism and digestion and the attempt to intentionally assimilate ecological and elemental powers is important, because you can go out on the beach or in the morning, get a little sun. But if you have this attitude that you want to take it into yourself more deeply, that you become engaged emotionally, psychologically, and with a different kind of physiology of, I want this to go somewhere more, and I want it to go right into my cells. I want it to go deeply into the subconscious. I don't just want to have a regular superficial human encounter with this element of the environment. I want it to bypass my surface and go to a deeper place. Just that very attitude has the ability to shift the way the organism is responding.
Yeah, I love both those points. Actually, on my YouTube channel, I have a 20-minute guided meditation that I found, that I put some violin to the background of Hakuin's butter meditation, and the whole thing is great because, like you said, he all of his kind of psychic and concentrated energy is way up in his head, and he's going through these like light and dark and deathly cold and super hot, and he's all out of whack essentially, thinking that he's like becoming this super enlightened person. And then he goes through this journey and finds this, like you said, Taoist master in a cave, and the Taoist master has like long fingernails and long hair and no furniture, and he's like, no, I just eat what the squirrels eat and maybe some fruit if I'm lucky. And then he teaches him this contemplation that just kind of brings you back into your body, and especially into like all the way down to the soles of your feet and your external skin, and kind of saliences to your conscious and unconscious mind, all of that part that you were neglecting, so that you could be in this like ecstatic perpetual communion with God in an unhealthy way. And it's great, these kind of masters that go to every doctor they can find, every local spiritual leader, and they find no solution, and then finally they find someone that shows them how to contemplate in a way that's actually more balanced and healthy. And yeah, I've done the butter visualization many times over months, and it's the more you give to it, the deeper it goes, and the more kind of like lingering presence in the rest of your life it has. So it's really cool. And I like too, like it matches the cognitive science you were saying, Layman, when your intent to indwell your environment is harmonized with the actual environment, the conscious attention, and almost like to harken back to Zeus in our early poem, when you really invite that stuff in, then it can re-enchant you and reorient you. So it's cool that we're saying all these kind of things.
The Hakuin story brings out for me just how good the Chinese wisdom tradition is at joining non-dual and vital together, right? Maybe they're not great at emotional vulnerability or sexuality. You don't see those things emphasized in their wisdom teachings very much, but this necessity of joining the grounded, rooted Taoist vitality with the extraordinary Taoist and Zen capacity to appreciate non-duality outside of socio-conceptual formulations of duality, that's really powerful, right? And it becomes even ambiguous in the Chinese tradition which one is the senior principle.
I lived, that was a sublime sharing, and I'm going to tell something ridiculous now, but I lived at a Javanese meditation center, a master's house for about 1 year, and was practicing with him. And it was going pretty deep, but I also got to a place where I was getting kind of stuck in the process. And we worked with it for a while, but finally his advice was, go to Bali, go to Kuta Beach, meet a Western girl and have a romp, and then come back to me. But he wanted me to go out and have some sexual experience and get the energy moving in the body in a different way before continuing with the practice. I actually didn't do that. I just went out and enjoyed nature. But yeah, he was definitely pointing towards that kind of vital stimulation as essential for the deeper integration work that we were trying to work on.
Yeah, I think that happened to Porphyry as well, one of Plotinus's greatest student, and he was getting so entrenched in Platonic philosophy that it was having maladaptive kind of health like non-benefits and harming his health a little bit. And he sent him on a vacation. And how I like that some Buddhist practices I've done and some workshops I've done, they really, there's a limit you can get to with your concentrated effort that you have to let life back in, and like grace or other power or just vacation, those kind of things, using what would normally be like a taboo as a stimulant to your growth. We've talked about this before, Layman, and it's really kind of cool. It also makes a lot of sense because you're not just an agent, you're in an arena, and if you don't let the arenic elements presence themselves, even if you're able to get into these kind of like ineffable kind of transcendent experiences and have these integrated kind of higher perceptual experiences, it's still not like the real. The real is transcends any idea or orientation that we can have, and often just letting that chaos back in is really interesting. I would love to see John talk more about, you know, the arena part and the non-intentional part of things, because it really homes and balances out all of this imaginal work, all of these ecologies of practices. And when you can get that playful openness and use the skillfulness that you're cultivating in your practices together, it's you stop worrying about existential crises and nihilism and loneliness and those kind of things that are attracting people in droves to digital spaces like these.
One of Gurdjieff's formulations is to divide your waking time into 3 chunks, right? So a third of the time you're doing your internal practice and your spirituality. You're not aspirationally doing it all the time. You're aspirationally doing it a third of the time. Another third of the time you're resting, regenerating, engaging in bodily vivification. And then another third of the time you're just automatically behaving to get your activities done, right? And that should be your goal going forward, because that's what allows the maximum amount of assimilation and integration of the inner work you're doing. Whereas if you do too much of it, you start to burn out and you start to deprive yourself of the conditions whereby those gains are assimilated subconsciously and biophysically.
Yeah, the power of rest and sleep and play are often not voiced in these conversations. And the balance element, especially if you have a tendency, if you're a really musical person, then getting physical practices or intellectual practices, or if you're a really physical person, building in time for that, and just doing nothing. I remember one time I was talking to this Buddhist monk and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm having all these problems. And he's like, oh, what should I do? And he turns to this other woman and he's like, well, what should we do? This is really intense. And then he's like, do nothing. And I started just sitting in a chair and resisting any urges to engage with whatever was happening, including inside myself. And within like 2 days, there was like a calm back inside of me that was I was so grateful for his advice.
The in the 8 limbs of yoga of Patanjali, right? There's yama and niyama, right? So yama, the Lord of Death, those are your disciplines. And niyama is the discipline it takes to not do certain things, right? There's the discipline to make yourself do all this stuff and the discipline to not do certain things. And you need both of those capacities among your primary tools for development.
I remember at the Krishnamurti school, Krishnamurti used to talk very much about the importance of leisure in the for the potential of growth, and that, you know, especially in certain parts of like urban India, or in certain parts of, you know, Korea and Japan and other places, there's not much appreciation for for leisure in the schooling environment. It's basically driving. But yeah, he really emphasized you need to create a space where there is that not doing time for teachers and for students in order to really flourish and for what's being learned both academically and interiorly to really be digested. So yeah.
This is probably one of the reasons there was such a flourishing of wisdom culture in ancient Greece, because the Greeks are so notoriously lazy and self-indulgent.
Well, they have the philosophical idea of Skole, and Johannes Niederhauser and Mark Vernon both have some good content on that. And when you're always engaged and disciplined, like Hakuin, or like our very workaholic, and there's no better way to like hide your problems than to like dive into workaholism, to really like, you know, avoid feeling deep feelings about what your life is in any moment. And it's so profound. Even I love Henry Thoreau's essay on walking, where he talks about sauntering and just like being in a place and trying to like get into a purposeless kind of open slowness, where all of a sudden like you notice the world again, and the non-teleological aspect of it, and you go, oh, there's beauty without effort, or I don't have to have this linear kind of discursive view of things. And it's really powerful, the capacity to balance effort. And I guess even in the episode where he talks about trying not to try, and the not trying part is the more interesting part of that than the trying part.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there have been a couple of moments where we could have ended this and I said another thing that fascinates me, so I'm not going to say that this time.
I'm feeling the implicit learning conditions to stop as well. Sweet. Any final thought, Bruce?
No, just enjoyed it as always. It covered a pretty good range of things, I think. We've definitely, I think, covered almost everything I was thinking about and stimulated by the episode. So yeah, really appreciated it.
We didn't get into the Guardians and stuff, but this was John's most occult episode.
Mm.
Well, we started with a hymn to Zeus. I think he's one of the best guardians of all goodness. So all right, it's been just beautifully lovely to talk to both of you. I really appreciate it. This is probably my favorite part of the week at this point. And I'll see you both next week then.
Cheers. Good to see you
Oh,
guys.
good. Yeah, take care.